August 25, 1944. The guns of Normandy had fallen silent, but for General Patton's tanks, the war was far from over. As his armored columns thundered toward the German border, a new enemy emerged: fuel. Without gasoline, the mighty Shermans would grind to a halt. And so, a different kind of army took to the road. An army of truckers, roaring day and night across France on a mission that would decide the fate of Europe: the Red Ball Express. The summer of 1944 belonged to the Allies. Paris was within reach. Patton's Third Army was devouring German divisions, and the dream of driving the Nazis back to the Rhine seemed just weeks away. But victory had a price: gasoline, ammunition, tires, food. Every bullet fired, every mile driven, drained the Allied war machine like a bleeding artery. Behind the glamour of tanks and thunder lay a brutal truth: the invasion force had outrun its lifeline. The ports at Normandy were still shattered, the railroads destroyed, and the depots lay hundreds of miles behind the front. Trucks were the only hope, tens of thousands of them. That's when the U.S. Army did something no army had ever done before. They built a highway that didn't exist, a continuous lifeline of roaring engines and grinding gears stretching from Normandy to the front. They called it the Red Ball Express, named after the red circle signs that marked its route and the red-painted trucks that screamed through France without stopping. But this was no ordinary convoy. It was chaos on wheels, and mud, wreckage, and danger at every turn. Convoys rolled 24 hours a day, headlights covered to hide from enemy aircraft, brakes burning on mountain slopes, engines choking in the dust, and the men behind the wheel? Most of them weren't soldiers of glory. They were black Americans, truck drivers and mechanics, fighting two wars at once, one against Hitler and one against prejudice. By late August 1944, the Allied advance had become a victim of its own success. Patton's tanks were rolling faster than logistics could follow. Fuel drums stacked at the Normandy beaches, but none could reach the front lines in time. Men were siphoning fuel from wrecked vehicles just to keep moving. For every mile gained, the supply lines stretched thinner, until the offensive teetered on collapse. General Dwight Eisenhower knew the numbers. Patton's Third Army alone consumed over 800,000 gallons of fuel per day. Without gasoline, every tank became a coffin, every advance a retreat. Something radical had to be done. That something became Operation Red Ball Express, an emergency supply system that would become the heartbeat of the Allied advance. Within 36 hours, Army engineers, logisticians, and transport units carved a dedicated network of one-way roads stretching from the Normandy depots at St. Lo and Cherbourg all the way to the front. Lines near Chartres and beyond, over 700 kilometers of twisting, dust-choked French roads. To keep traffic moving, two parallel routes were created, one eastbound for loaded trucks, one westbound for empty returns. Signs with a bright red ball marked the path, a signal that nothing on that route could stop the convoys. French civilians, military traffic, even MPs, all were ordered to clear the road when the red ball rolled through. And when it rolled, it was a sight to behold. Convoy after convoy of GMC CCKW deuce and a halves thundered across France, each truck carrying up to 2.5 tons of critical supplies: gasoline, ammunition, food, spare parts. The air was thick with dust and diesel fumes, the sound of gears grinding and engines roaring without pause. Soldiers called it hell on wheels without the tanks. Most of the men driving those trucks were African Americans. Over 75% of the Red Ball's manpower came from black truck drivers, mechanics and laborers. They were soldiers of the Transportation Corps, often overlooked, often discriminated against, but now indispensable. They worked 16-hour shifts, sometimes more, sleeping beside their trucks, eating cold rations, pushing through exhaustion and danger. German aircraft still prowled the skies, strafing convoys at dawn and dusk. The Luftwaffe was weak but not dead. Mines and snipers haunted the back roads. Some nights, trucks vanished without a trace. Others burned in the darkness, their cargo igniting the countryside. But still they drove. One driver recalled later, "We drove by instinct. No lights, no rest, no mercy. We didn't have maps, just the truck ahead of us. If he went off the road, so did we. To keep the convoys alive, mechanics became magicians. Broken axles were welded from scrap. Tires were retreaded with wire. Some men used gasoline as soap just to clean their hands, and while the front-line troops rarely saw them, they felt their presence every day. Every tank that advanced, every artillery gun that fired, did so because the Red Ball had delivered its lifeblood. By early September, the system was moving over 12,000 tons of supplies per day, more than any motor transport operation in history at that time. It was messy, improvised, dangerous, but it worked. The Red Ball Express turned chaos into rhythm, fatigue into fuel. It was the artery of victory, but for those who lived it, the price was brutal. Sleep deprivation, mechanical failure, and constant peril turned every mile into a battle of will. For many drivers, the Red Ball was not just a mission, it was survival. And as the front pushed closer to Germany, the convoys faced new dangers, longer routes, worse weather, and German counterattacks. The Express had saved the Allied advance once, but to keep it alive, men would have to drive through hell itself. By mid-September 1944, the Red Ball Express had become more than a supply line. It was a legend in motion. From the shattered ruins of St. Lo to the smoke-filled skies over Verdun, the thunder of engines never stopped. Trucks rolled day and night, headlights hooded to slits, pushing through darkness so thick drivers said they could taste it. Rain turned the French backroads into rivers of mud. Dust became sludge, clogging filters, freezing gears. Drivers learned to steer by instinct, their hands blistered and black with grease. Most had no maps, no radios, just a chain of dim taillights stretching into infinity. Lose sight of that red glow, and you were lost, or worse. Each convoy was a moving target. German fighter bombers still prowled the skies, hunting easy prey. Some nights, flares would burst overhead, bright white magnesium suns, followed by the shriek of diving engines. Trucks scattered for the ditches, men diving beneath their wheels as machine gun fire shredded the road. When the silence returned, engines sputtered back to life, headlights stayed dark, and the convoy rolled on. But the greatest enemy wasn't the Luftwaffe. It was fatigue. 16-hour shifts were the norm. Some men went days without proper sleep. Others nodded off behind the wheel, jolting awake as their truck skidded into ditches. Yet the orders were absolute. Keep the supplies moving. Every delay meant tanks stopped, soldiers starved, battles stalled. Fuel convoys were the most dangerous. The 5-gallon jerry cans stacked in their beds turned each truck into a rolling bomb. One spark, one stray bullet, and the night became daylight. Still, they drove. 60 trucks to a convoy, 80 miles an hour downhill if the brakes held. To keep the wheels turning, GMC CCCKWs were pushed beyond design. Mechanics nicknamed them Jimmy, a loyal beast of burden that could haul 5,000 pounds over terrain where no other truck dared. Their engines roared, coughed, and roared. Again, patched together with baling wire, chewing gum, and prayer. In the cab, the men rode through exhaustion and monotony. Some sang to stay awake. Others chewed coffee grounds or smoked until their lips blistered. Radios blasted swing music when signals reached. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, ghosts of a world that felt a lifetime away. Many of these drivers were just boys, barely 20. They'd come from Mississippi, Detroit, Chicago, New York. Some had never driven a car before the war. Now they commanded 10-ton machines across a continent, carrying the fate of an army on their backs. And still, they faced the war within the war. In an army that kept its units segregated, these black soldiers were often treated as expendable, denied combat glory, confined to the rear. Yet the irony was brutal. Without them, the front wouldn't exist. One officer later said, "If it wasn't for the Red Ball, our tanks would have died in France. Even German prisoners marveled at it. Captured Wehrmacht officers called it der rollende Wahnsinn, the rolling madness. They couldn't believe the Allies could maintain such a torrent of movement. Every hour, hundreds of trucks roared past their columns of weary, retreating men. By the end of September, the numbers spoke for themselves. More than 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers, and 12,000 tons of supplies per day. Ammunition, rations, gasoline, spare parts, everything that kept the Allied machine alive flowed through that artery. But no amount of grit could fight geography. The farther the front advanced, the longer the lifeline stretched. The depots moved slower than the tanks, and the Red Ball was forced to extend beyond endurance. Trucks wore out, drivers collapsed, and breakdowns began to multiply. Still, the convoys rolled. One driver wrote in his diary, "When you're in the Red Ball, there's no yesterday, no tomorrow, just the road. The sound of gears, the smell of diesel, and the fear that the next bend might be your last." As autumn closed in, the miracle of momentum began to falter. The roads to Belgium were longer, narrower, and clogged with retreating Germans. The weather turned foul, freezing rain, mud, and fog thicker than smoke. What had begun as a lifeline now became a war of attrition fought with wheels instead of bullets. But the men behind those wheels had come too far to stop. They'd built their own brotherhood, bound not by rank or uniform, but by the shared roar of engines and the endless ribbon of road ahead. They called it the Highway of Hell. Yet, every dawn when the fog lifted, it kept on moving, a river of steel, sweat, and willpower. The Red Ball Express had proven that logistics could win wars, but the price of that victory was still climbing. And as the push toward Germany intensified, those same drivers would face the greatest test of all, keeping the war alive when the world itself seemed determined to stop them. By October 1944, the Red Ball Express had become the most critical artery in the European war, and the most abused. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't clean, but it kept the Allied war machine alive when everything else had failed. For 83 relentless days, the road from Normandy to the front had been a ceaseless thunder of engines, a man-made miracle of motion. But miracles come at a cost, and the Red Ball was starting to bleed. The trucks were falling apart. Engines, never designed to run 24 hours a day, were cooked beyond repair. Tires shredded, brakes disintegrated. Mechanics cannibalized dead vehicles to keep the living ones rolling, robbing axles, gearboxes, and engines from wrecks still smoldering at the roadside. Supply officers joked that the only thing the Red Ball didn't have to haul was itself, and the men, the drivers, were near collapse. They'd been on the road for weeks, sleeping beside their trucks, eating when they could, driving through mud, rain, and German artillery. Some had driven so long they could no longer tell the difference between day and night. Their eyes twitched from exhaustion, their hands shook from constant vibration. More than a few simply fell asleep at the wheel and never woke up, yet they refused to quit. To the front-line soldiers, the Red Ball men were ghosts, rarely seen but always felt. Every tank that fired, every ration eaten, every mile advanced came from their work. But back in the rear, many of them still faced the same old prejudice. Their courage and sacrifice were rarely recognized. Their accomplishments buried beneath the headlines of infantry heroes and armored divisions. Still, they kept driving, because deep down, they knew. This was their war, too. When General Patton's tanks roared toward the Moselle River in early fall, they were running almost entirely on Red Ball gasoline. The convoys had delivered over 100 million gallons of fuel, 400,000 tons of supplies, enough to power the entire Third Army across France. Eisenhower called it the most brilliant logistical achievement of the war. Patton simply said, "My men can fight only as long as your trucks deliver." But as the front lines stretched toward Belgium and the German border, the distances became impossible. The Red Ball's 700-mile lifeline had turned into a 1,000-mile ordeal. Fuel for the trucks themselves consumed a terrifying share of their cargo, almost half of. Every gallon hauled forward went right back into the convoy's own tanks, and then came the weather. The skies turned black. The rain returned with vengeance, hammering the roads into rivers of mud. Tires sank to their rims, engines sputtered, brakes froze. Convoys backed up for miles, stuck in swamps of churned soil. Drivers worked with shovels and chains, pulling one another out inch by inch. The red ball became a crawling beast, still alive, but gasping. Worse still, the Germans had realized its importance. Sniper attacks and mines along the route increased. Some convoys vanished entirely, ambushed in the dark. Luftwaffe aircraft, desperate for any chance to strike, hit fuel convoys near Liège and Namur. The night sky burned for miles. Even the roads themselves became weapons. Allied military police had to guard intersections 24 hours a day, directing the endless streams of trucks, keeping them from colliding in the chaos. Some MPs collapsed on duty, too tired to stand. But despite it all, despite the exhaustion, the losses, the rain, the convoys never stopped. One soldier remembered, "We were tired, cold, and hungry. But when we saw those red ball trucks coming up the road, we knew we'd eat that night. We knew we'd fight another day." By late November, the impossible had been done. The Allied advance had reached the gates of Germany. The Red Ball Express, born in desperation on the beaches of Normandy, had delivered its army to the very edge of victory. And then, it was over. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially shut down. The port of Antwerp had finally opened, and supplies could now come directly by rail. The drivers were reassigned, the trucks parked, the signs taken down. The roaring artery of engines and courage went silent. There were no parades, no medals, just exhaustion and relief. The men who'd driven through hell packed their gear and moved on, replaced by a system that owed them everything. Most of the Red Ball soldiers, especially the black drivers, returned home to a country still blind to what they'd done. Many of their names were never recorded, their stories lost in the noise of history. But their legacy rolled on, because what they built wasn't just a supply line. It was proof that logistics wins wars. The Red Ball Express became the model for every modern military convoy system that followed. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Every fuel truck, every supply line, every road paved for war traced its roots back to that screaming highway through France. And in the years that followed, history began to catch up. The U.S. Army would later recognize the Red Ball Express as one of the most extraordinary achievements of World War II, and the courage of its drivers as equal to any combat hero. One of them, Staff Sergeant Eddie Carter, said it best. "We didn't carry rifles. We carried the war itself. Every drop of gas, every bullet, every meal. That was our fight." When the Red Ball finally stopped, Europe was already on the brink of liberation. Its mission complete, its men scattered. But the road they carved remained, not in maps or medals, but in the memory of those who understood what real endurance looked like. It wasn't fought with glory. It was fought with grit, sweat, and steel wheels grinding through the mud, and without it, the tanks that broke through the Siegfried Line would have never made it out of Normandy. When the last truck of the Red Ball Express rolled to a stop in November 1944, there was no music, no marching band. Just the sound of cooling engines and tired men stepping out into the cold French dawn. They'd done what no one thought possible, and then they disappeared quietly back into history. But the truth is, every victory the Allies celebrated after that moment, every mile gained, every city liberated, still bore the fingerprints of those drivers. Without them, Patton's tanks would have starved in the fields of France. Without them, Eisenhower's armies would have ground to a halt before ever reaching the German border. And without them, the Allied dream of crushing the Third Reich before winter would have died on the Normandy roads. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply system. It was a symbol. A roaring, tire-screeching, diesel-burning reminder that wars are not won only by those who pull the trigger, but by those who keep the trigger fed. Over 5,900 trucks, 23,000 drivers, 75% of them black, carried the weight of an entire continent's freedom on their shoulders. They faced racism in their own ranks, the wrath of the enemy ahead, and the indifference of the world behind them. Yet they never faltered. For every medal awarded to a general, there were 1,000 unsung miles driven in the dark by men whose names history forgot. They didn't seek fame, only the next delivery, the next engine start, the next convoy rolling through the night. Years later, when historians tried to measure what had made victory in Europe possible, it wasn't just the Sherman tank or the P-51 Mustang they pointed to. It was logistics, the quiet miracle of movement. The unbroken rhythm of supply and demand, made real by human hands, human will, and human sacrifice. The Red Ball Express proved that even in the age of tanks and bombers, the true weapon of victory was perseverance. One veteran summed it up simply: you can't shoot without bullets. You can't move without gas. And we made sure they had both. Today, monuments stand in Normandy and Verdun, marking the routes where those convoys thundered past. Few who drive those roads now can imagine the sound, 6,000 engines roaring through rain and fire. But the ground remembers. The tire tracks may be gone, but the echoes of courage still hum beneath the soil. The Red Ball Express didn't just deliver supplies, it delivered victory. And the men who drove it, through mud, fear, and exhaustion, delivered something even greater. Proof that the strength of an army lies not in its firepower, but in its endurance. Because in the end, wars are not won by the sharpness of steel, but by the hands that keep the steel moving.